Satoru Gojo and Megumi Fushiguro shared one of Jujutsu Kaisen's most interesting dynamics. On the surface, it might not really seem that way. I mean, it's not like they shared that much time together on screen either. And with different dynamics between characters like Gojo and Sukuna, Yuji and Sukuna, and Gojo and Yuta, it's easy to forget about what makes the relationship between these two so special compared to others in the story. Despite each being born with one of the two best curse techniques respectively, Gojo and Megumi couldn't stand further apart on almost any spectrum. And yet, they also have a whole lot more in common than one might realize. As victims born into the world of Jujutsu, both were burdened with and cursed by their own curse technique. Albeit under completely different circumstances, both were forced to acknowledge the reality of such burden from an early age. You could say that what one lacked, the other had in abundance, and vice versa. And yet both, in their relationship and their individuality, there was still something missing. Something neither could figure out. It wasn't the same thing for both, of course, where one struggled with being the strongest and the solitude that came with it. The other struggled to give it his all because he couldn't envision a version of himself stronger than he already was. Ironically, Gojo is who was able to get Megumi to stop holding back, and Megumi was Gojo's first student with whom he was able to first put his dream in motion. Satoru being born into the Gojo clan with their most prized curse technique instantly made him the single most valuable asset in all of the Jujutsu world. Not a lot is known about his upbringing, but we do know he's known of the power he possessed and how it made him a target from a young age. In a recent interview, Gege Akutami talked a bit about Gojo's childhood, filling in some blanks that add some context to why he was the way he was. He said Gojo got fed up with his overbearing family, with whom he became distant at an early age since they couldn't get involved with his education as a sorcerer. Akutami confirms Gojo was an only child, and goes on to imply that because he was treated differently, he didn't have normal interactions with his relatives and was often going on missions as part of elite jujutsu training of the big three clans. So Gojo wasn't really able to build any meaningful bond with anyone until he met Geto. Geto's descent, however, changes Gojo forever. On top of Riko being killed by Toji, it's what makes him ponder the question, what's really the meaning of being the strongest if you can't always save who you want? His outgoing, unserious personality masked the turmoil underneath his skin. Because of everything expected from him, he was never afforded the luxury to find himself beyond his role, something he could only make up with unparalleled self-confidence. However, Gojo grew somewhat detached and came to understand that the world of Jujutsu must be reset. He found what drives him, but it's something he couldn't do alone. Gojo goes from being born with basically everything at his reach to understanding that there's still nothing he can do to change things by himself. When granted everything, you can't do anything, is actually something he tells Jogo when he explains his domain, but I think it's fitting how this really sums up Gojo himself. As someone who always struggled with his identity beyond being the strongest, along with his inability to relate to others and their struggles, it's easy to see why Gojo was nothing more than the benefactor and the one great teacher to Megumi, even if few cared for them like they cared for each other. Megumi, on the other hand, had his own reasons for being distant and stoic. Being an orphan at a young age with no knowledge of his parents besides the fact that his mother died and his father abandoned him, he had to get by and manage with his slightly older stepsister. Megumi was granted two alternatives for a shot at a better life for him and Tsumiki. Aware that he was born with unique abilities, he accepted Gojo's offer of going to Jujutsu High, receiving financial support with the promise that he would grow as a strong sorcerer in return. Unlike Gojo, he wasn't born into the Jujutsu world, yet they were both thrust into it for reasons bigger than themselves. But Megumi couldn't care less about being a sorcerer, thinking things like Jujutsu sorcerers are stupid and that who the hell was he supposed to save? It's not until after Tsumiki's curse that he begins to push himself to do everything in his power to save her and bring her back. Similar to how Gojo had to lose Geto to be driven, Megumi had to lose Tsumiki. And in Yuji, Megumi found the same qualities he saw in Tsumiki, leading him to save Itadori, since he only saves people he deems worth saving. But when that backfires on himself, the very foundation of his resolve is shaken. Imagining a future version of himself who's freely surpassed his limits was something Megumi was able to do, reinforcing his ideals of saving people unequally. But Sukuna shatters that ideal when he kills the only people Megumi cared for growing up. When Yuji helps him reinforce his ideal once again, he finds the strength to fight Sukuna from inside. All people around Megumi did was just expect more and more from him. Only Yuji valued him for who he was regardless of anything else. What Gojo lost in Geto, Megumi finally realized he had in Yuji, and he had to come to terms with the consequences of his own mistakes, just like Gojo was forced to do so. His reaction to the letter Gojo left him speaks to how despite their lack of a stronger bond, they knew each other better than most. It's just that their respective internal conflicts stood as barriers between them. While Megumi felt indebted to Gojo, Gojo just expected Megumi's best. Megumi was robbed of his agency by the strongest, while Gojo was robbed of his agency for being the strongest. I mean, Gojo was killed at the hands of Megumi possessed by Sukuna, as Megumi paid the ultimate price for his lack of self-worth. You see, while Gojo was freed from his burden, Megumi only sank deeper before being saved. The connection between these two characters runs deep and can be traced back to long before they met or were even born. The story about the Zenin and Gojo clan heads killing each other in a deathmatch many years ago, to me adds to how these characters reflect parts of each other and how their stories were always fated to play out the way they did. Though it is funny and yet another similarity how neither of them wanted anything to do with their respective clans, despite Gojo having actually been born into it and Megumi not really having a family. The 10 Shadows technique catching Sukuna's attention, his enchained binding vow with Yuji, and the flashback of Gojo telling Megumi the story of the clan heads were all moments intricately placed like dominoes that led to the conclusions of their respective stories. At the end of the day, the story of one cannot be told without bringing up the other. Two characters that really struggle to understand the true value of their own strength. While Gojo is arguably the best written character in JJK, Megumi not so much. Both, though, embody some of the most prevalent themes in the story. How they're presented and executed through them is something I really appreciate and actually would have loved to see more of. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Let me know what you think about how Megumi and Gojo were handled in the story of Jujutsu Kaisen. Drop a comment. Much love and take care. Peace.